pleasure to be here in Paris with all of you, and thank you so much for the nice weather, and also to the organizers for the invitation. It's a tremendous opportunity to come to Paris in the spring to speak about something I love with people who are interested in it. What could be better? Here we are. So, what will I try to do tonight? Well, I hope by the end you'll have some idea of what I mean by Un-GIS and why we did it in the context of the particular project I'm going to talk about. Pleiades or Pleiades or Pleiades, you can pronounce it any way you want, I don't care. I want to take 4 or 5 passes at trying to explain what Pleiades is and why it is not a geographic information system, but it does contain geographic information, and what distinction we're trying to make there and why. It seems like the best way to present this over the course of an hour or a little bit less is first by talking about what Pleiades is. So that's a consideration of what the geographers and the GI scientists might call coverage. But I'm going to go beyond just spatial coverage and talk about temporal and thematic. What kind of stuff is in Pleiades and why is it there? And then we'll talk about what information scientists sometimes call entities. What are the major objects of concern that we are modeling or representing in this information system, and how are they constructed and how are they represented to users and to other systems? And then a third concern is, how does that data come to be in that format, and how does it come to be online? And that's curation and review. What is our process for adding content to Pleiades, for publishing it after review, and so on? Because Pleiades is a living project. It is not like a book that's been delivered to the library shelves or via Amazon or some other bookstore killing entity, but is in fact a living journal or encyclopedia that's constantly turning over new information. How does that work? We'll spend a little bit of time, not too much, talking about how it came to be and where it came from. Most of that will be sort of as an aside along the way. And then we'll finish with a discussion of a few of the features and functions of Pleiades that won't necessarily have been foregrounded in the discussion up to that point. So all along, we'll be actually looking at Pleiades on the web, live as it works today, and then we'll wrap up with a bit of a discussion about some of the things that are not perhaps so obvious about the way it comes together, and hopefully leave time for questions and discussion if any of those arrive. So there we are. That's the overview. That's the plan. And so we move on to what is in Pleiades. What is its coverage? Well, here's the famous heat map. Every geographic project has to have a heat map. And by heat map, we mean some kind of evocative cartographic presentation of how much stuff is in a particular spot on the Earth's surface or some other planetary body. In the case of Pleiades, there's not any real scale that I'm trying to evoke here, but you can see that there are specific areas of concentration, there's kind of a general extent, and then there are peripheries of the data set that are more spotty or sparse. So this is, we've imposed modern country boundaries on this just as a frame of reference. Pleiades doesn't care what country something is in because we're mostly concerned about things that are pre-modern. And so our content has been in many different administrative, inside different administrative boundaries or none over time. And so the countries are just there to help us orient ourselves, not to organize the data. This information is brought together by a community of people that we'll get to know a little bit about as we go along, and it's meant to provide information about the pre-modern or ancient world, and it has both spatial and non-spatial information in it. Pleiades, and here we begin already to unpack the word Un-GIS, is concerned about places as humans have understood them in time. It is not concerned about points, lines, and polygons in some database. There are lots of places from the ancient and medieval world that we know about because someone has written about them, or we have objects that attest to their existence, but that we cannot localize on the ground today. We may have already excavated an archaeological site that corresponds to one, but we can't be sure because we haven't found something on site that correlates with the textual tradition or the coinage that's found other places to make us certain that a particular site is Pleiades. And right now, of the nearly 35,000 place records that we have in Pleiades, almost 6,400 of them are unlocated. So these are places we are pretty sure existed, that had some identity in antiquity, but that we cannot locate in the current state of our knowledge and the state of the work that's been done for this project and others. This is not to say that this is the sum total of known or unknown or unlocated places from the ancient world. This is within Pleiades' scope at present, what we know and don't know. But most of these unlocated places will be ones for which there is not a scholarly solution as to its location at this time. There are other kinds of coverage we might care to know about in the context of Pleiades, and these have to do more with cultural concerns, with temporal concerns. Pleiades has a mechanism for talking about places and typing them. This is a common concern of scholars, of geographic enterprises and data programs, and we do it too. It's the sort of things you would expect, settlements and temples and all that sort of thing, and maybe some things you wouldn't expect unless you knew a particular area. We have a growing list. We do not have a comprehensive attempt to provide every type of thing you might ever have found geographically in human history. What we have tried to do is, as our data expands, as we refine our data, we have tried to make sure we have an appropriate definition and term for it. So our vocabulary of terms for describing ancient places grows over time as the data demands, or as we find problems in the way we have done our classification. We have legacy data that came in certain categories that we've had to split into different categories as we've gone along. And so this grows. I'll talk about this again when we actually get to looking at places in Pleiades, but one of the things we're in the process of doing now is connecting our terms to a thing called the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. This is a widely used hierarchical classification system created by the Getty Research Institute. It's used by many museums, not all, of course, and in other data sets. And the reason we are doing that is so that when our data is exported for other uses, people will have access to not just our own vocabulary, but where there are clear equivalences with a widely used standard vocabulary, they will also have that access. And this has been a principle of how we tried to work all along, because Pleiades is a completely open resource. The data is there for scholars and students and enthusiasts to take and use and answer new questions, find out things they want to know. And so we want our data to be not only open and free, but as usable as possible. And so where we have some kind of idiosyncratic mechanism for defining things, we try to match it up with something that's more general or more widely known, so that it's easier for a person who takes our data to do something with it. The point needs reiterating, though, that all of this is sparse to some degree. We don't, as I said, have every single kind of thing, nor will you necessarily find, once you start digging into the data, that all temples in the ancient world are there, or that, in fact, all sites of temples have been registered as such. The data, again, is a function of what work has been done on it, where it's been brought in from other places. We don't make any claim to comprehensivity. We try to be accurate insofar as what we publish, but not necessarily complete or comprehensive. And that is a caveat emptor, if you will. Let the user beware. We also have named time periods. These right now are frankly terrifying and a mess. They derive in some cases from other data sets that were initially brought together to begin building Pleiades, and so reflect the concerns and limitations of those projects. We also have information that's been added ad hoc as our users have brought needs to us that were not reflected in the initial set. We made a decision early on that we were not going to attempt to assign specific proleptic Julian dates to the start and end of every single place that occurs in Pleiades, for the simple reason of practicality. We would be much slower at producing the data for you than we have been if we had attempted to determine a foundation date, a Florowit period, and so on. So what Pleiades does is to assert within certain named time periods that can be bounded in a proleptic Julian calendar, we assert the relevance of a particular, the activity at a particular location, or the relevance of a particular name during those name periods. And so the Pleiades user will find several name periods associated with a given name or a given location that provides that generalized information about time. We are in the process of moving our management of these named time periods to an external project called Pleiades, which attempts to be a gazetteer or vocabulary of named time periods for scholarly purposes. This is a project that's run out of the University of Texas and the University of North Carolina in the United States, and it is attempting to provide stable identifying numbers for each time period that a person might want to cite. And these are backed up by references to whatever publication or presentation might be found that makes assertions about time periods, associations with different chronology, and so on. And the idea is to provide across multiple humanities and scholarly data systems a constant mechanism for doing this kind of citation, so that we can begin to bring our data together around time in different contexts. You can still define your own periods in Pleiades, but it gives us a way to share that information with others and to match things up. So we're in the beginning stages of moving to that platform. But by way of coverage, I thought it was worth alerting you to that in terms of the way Pleiades works. So that's a bit about coverage. I think it's probably worthwhile moving on and actually taking a look at what's in Pleiades instead of talking in a general way about some of the bits and pieces. So let's talk about our entities. When we have a new user who comes to Pleiades who wants to contribute something, or who is trying to use Pleiades in a, how should we say, a less than naive way, we generally tell them to go read our conceptual overview, which has this link here. You can find it in most major search engines simply by typing Pleiades conceptual overview. And if you don't get something about the constellation, you get us for that particular search. There are 4 main entities that we're concerned about in Pleiades: places, locations, names, and connections. These are very distinct things for us, and the terminology matters. In general, talking about things geographic, the word place, the word location, these tend to move around. But in certain geographic information contexts, they have specific meanings. And we, not wanting to be left behind, picked particular meanings for those to use in our project as well. Here again, we raise the idea of the Un-GIS. We think about our unlocated places, places we can't find. They're represented only by a name in a source tradition. We have places that have no name. They're well documented through archaeological discovery and publication, but we don't know what they were called in antiquity. They may not even have a name today if you're in a non-urban area and the place is fairly recently discovered. It may have nothing more than some numerical designation on a archaeological survey map. And so place is a cognitive bundle of understandings about geography for us. If I could meet you there for lunch, if you could direct me to it for a particular purpose, if you could tell me a little bit about it and say its name and convince me that it was a geographic place at one time, that's what Pleiades models as a place. It's that bundle of understandings, that collection of information. And this is an idea that we've borrowed from the geographic theory, and it's not new to us, but it is one that's not commonly reflected in geographic information systems. Geographic information systems want you to have geometry to get started, because otherwise you can't put it in space. That's what they're about. There are non-standard, non-commercial academic systems for doing some of the kinds of things we do. But in terms of Esri products, in terms of GRASS, in terms of the various other well-known names for geographic information systems, you're immediately confronted with this problem that you can't have a first-class entity unless you have coordinates. And so if you're dealing with geography that is sparse and is uncertain like ours is, you have to do something else. You have to create a bounding box, or you have to create some kind of a polygon that represents the possible area in which it falls. And we didn't want to get into that business of creating tightly bounded things that had very specific geometries that we had to then whisper through metadata and documentation, hey, this is not really exactly where it is. It's somewhere in here. We wanted instead a model that reflected only the information we had. And so we said, let's have a place, and it can have a location, which could then hold the specific geometry. It could have names if we have toponymy for it, and it could be connected to other places. It could have relationships with other places, whether those are topological or otherwise. We'll unpack those in a minute. So what does a place look like in Pleiades? Well, we're all humans. We tend to experience information systems on the web by way of a web interface through a web browser. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to visit the web interface for Pleiades, and we're going to look at, as it happens, randomly, ancient Paris, Lutetia of the Parisi. This is what you're confronted with if you visit a Pleiades place page with a browser. You're human. You get some sort of a title for the entry, and then you work your way down. Maybe you get a more or less helpful summary description. This is particularly handy if you're looking for a place that is not got a unique name. Lutetia, happily, is a unique name in what we have so far from the Greek and Roman world in Pleiades. But you might, unfortunately, be looking for Alexandria, and then you're going to have to differentiate between 30-some that we know about. And sometimes a summary that's been written can help you, as a human, do that disambiguating. Got some other information we'll come back to, and then here are our locations and our names. In this particular case, we have two different locations, and we'll talk about why we have two in a minute. And then we also have some names. If we look at the map and zoom in a bit, we can match up this little location icon and see that at the appropriate resolution, they differ from each other somewhat in location. Since you all know Paris, we'll actually show you where those two things are falling. They're falling both on the island, where Lutetia seems to have been headquartered in antiquity. And then we've got some other little green boxes that we'll talk about in a minute. But those are your locations. They're also contributing to this orange dot right here. This orange dot is, in geocomputing parlance, a centroid. It's looking at the geometries of the locations and making a calculation of, sometimes we call it center of mass in English. It's meant to be kind of the central point relative to all the other geometries you're considering. This we call in Pleiades our representative point. The system creates one for each place we have in Pleiades, and it's right here. That's meant to give you a quick and easy dot to get on your map or into your other project. It's copied into all of our export data. It's there for you to use. You can copy it to your clipboard right here, plunk it into something else, and go on about your business. But it's a calculated point based on locations in the first instance. Continuing our summary of the page, we have all these different names. You can see that, I better look at my notes and make sure I don't forget to tell you anything interesting. that we have a very flat list of names. In some kinds of gazetteers, you'll find the primary name and alternate names. You'll find various kinds of groupings. You'll see various subgroupings around major orthographic variants and minor orthographic variants. So on. Pleiades doesn't make these kinds of big hierarchical piles of toponymy. We flatten it all and say, these are all strings that are meant in some human language to be proper nouns designating this place. Or in the case of an ethnic name, the people who are thought to be the inhabitants or owners thereof. We give our users the ability to distinguish by language and writing system. We try not to conflate multiple forms across languages and writing systems. So if it's in Latin and English and something else, all using the same Roman characters, we would have those as separate entries. Because they have different temporal signatures, they may have different source signatures. Likewise, small orthographic variants that show up because of source tradition or even preference in modern editions of texts, we try to make it possible to distinguish between them. Lutetia is fairly well elaborated in Pleiades. You will not find all our records this thoroughly laid out. You may also find that there's yet another variant in some source that we don't have, and we don't have every single modern language. But we have the ones that are widely used by our users, and where we get variations that might potentially cause someone to fail at search if we didn't have them, right? This is another reason why we encourage our contributors to provide us with as many Romanized forms of names that are not in Roman character writing systems, so that, again, naive users or users not skilled in a particular language or don't have the right keyboard interpreter can nonetheless potentially find a form either that they know of or that has occurred in some secondary reading of theirs that's been transliterated according to some system. This happens fairly frequently. We have a couple of connections here. This, of course, if you know the ancient history of Lutetia, is not by any means complete for the relationships between Lutetia and other places, but it's a start. Caesar tells us that Lutetia was a city of the Parisi, so we have this administrative connection between our city and our place entry for that tribal unit. We consider, because tribal units or units of people tend to have territories or areas of occupation or areas of activity, we treat them as places because they have a geographic aspect, they have a spatial footprint. Whether we know it or not, we can say that Lutetia, on the testimony of Caesar, is a particular, belongs to a particular people at a particular period. We could go on and add similar relationships for the successive Roman provinces and so on, and so we could see them at different times. These connections, just like our names and places, can be bounded in time with the time periods. We could tie them to specific references. I think in this particular case, we'll see that Caesar is actually in here, and because there's an edition of Caesar in the Perseus digital library, we can actually go read what the man had to say. It's pretty terse, as you might imagine, and our DNS lookups are slow, so we're not going to spend a bunch of time on that. Lutetia is also on or intersecting with the river. We have an ongoing debate in Pleiades as to exactly what terminology we should be using around connections with rivers and roads and cities. You know, are we on? Do we intersect? Do we flow through? And these are areas that we're trying to refine what our options are and our policy. So you may see different entries done slightly differently. We're trying to assemble a mass of assertions that then we can look at and discuss with each other and then normalize them. We'll go back and bring them into alignment with each other. Lutetia is also getting some connections from some other places. Here we have an intersect with a attested road network component. we also have a couple of monuments that are attested in the archaeology that are asserting a connection to Lutetia. And as a human, you've got all these links here. You can go see what we have for each place. And to the extent that our graph carries you on through connections, you can kind of wander around parts of the ancient world in this way and get a sense of what's related to what. It's still very sparse at this point. We have a lot of work to do. There are classes of relationships that we can build sort of en masse once we're sure we know the mechanism to use for a particular, or the terminology to use for a particular relationship. But there are others that have to be created step by step. One of the things we want to avoid doing is making lots of assertions about containment, administrative containment, regional containment, on the basis of secondary and tertiary reference works, especially those meant for general use, or those created in the 19th century to organize data sets and organize corpora of inscriptions and organize collections of coins. Because what tends to happen with those is a particular scholarly interpretation, let's say, of the extents and bounds of the Roman provinces is taken as an organizing mechanism for a bunch of modern published data. You take a particular interpretation at a particular time based on a particular bit of data, and then you say, our best guess is the boundaries are here, and then that's the Roman provinces and what they contain. You'll see this in the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum. You'll see it in a lot of sources. It's an excellent organizational tool, particularly in the context of large, multi-volume, codex-based reference works. But it's actually problematic if what you're trying to do is really understand the Roman provinces. So there are a lot of cases in which we need to go back to the scholarly research work and the detailed publications that determine on the basis of testimony what town is in what province at what time. How do you know these things? You know things like a particular governor, there's epigraphic evidence that he is holding conventus in particular towns in this province in this particular year. So those are attestations. He wouldn't be there if he weren't conducting business of the province. There are other kinds of evidence as well, but we want to be building up those kinds of connections, especially the administrative and cultural ones, from fine-grained source material rather than kind of broad-brush magisterial interpretations where we can. That's why you won't find the provinces comprehensively laid out in Pleiades at this time. We'll look at a bit more of those in a bit, I think, but it's probably worth having a look at a couple of other things so we can see how this stuff comes together. I want to take you to Nineveh. Get out of Europe for a bit. And you can see how one group of our contributors are making use of connections. We've got locations and names, just as you would expect, and then a very large number of connections coming in from Nineveh. Let's zoom in on the map and take a look at almost all of them are clustered if you get in and around the ancient site. And what's going on here is we have a group of users who are working systematically through cuneiform testimony for the names of the gates, the temples, and the shrines in ancient Nineveh and other Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian sites. And so we're starting to build up not just information about each of those monuments, which is great, but we're also beginning to build up an impression of the footprint of the site insofar as we're able to locate this material today. And I'm looking forward to a day when these two dots, these two locations that came in from other atlases, can be got rid of. We get rid of these blue little compass things and end up with a footprint, a spread of connection locations that then evoke the extent of our knowledge of ancient Nineveh. We can do this with, I I think with peoples too, we were talking about the Parisi. Let's look at the Trey Theory. Here again, I think our source is Caesar, and this is an earlier set of connections that haven't been typed. They were put into Pleiades fairly early as an experiment. But here we have a people for whom we have no boundaries. We can't draw a polygon based on some description of the boundaries, so on. But we can scatter these points that correspond to the connected the connected places. These are mostly towns and fortifications that are associated with them. The associations here, I think, are all coming from Caesar, but they might equally come from inscriptions. They might come on the basis of finds of coinage or particular kinds of pottery. You could do lots of things with this. And certainly these are modeling methods that are used in particular research tasks, but it's a way for us in Pleiades to avoid having to draw a polygon for everything. We can instead create this scatter, and if you wanted then to calculate a polygon, a convex hull, a bounding box that takes in these places, you could do that, you know, for a particular research task. But we wouldn't be asserting those boundaries for you. We would just be evoking them on the basis of connections. We could go lots of places with all this. I think you can imagine, you know, pick your particular relationship between ancient places. Are you interested in Greek synoikism? Are you interested in short-lived tributary relationships, say, think the Athenian Empire? All of these things could potentially be modeled as connections, either in Pleiades or in, you know, some other research system that you're creating. Pleiades, over time, I think, is going to develop a set of them that we think are of sufficient scope and a sufficient interest, and there's sufficient evidence for that we'll start incorporating them as a standard option in Pleiades into our data. But right now, we're in an experimental place. How does this information get into Pleiades? Well, you've already seen the homepage, so we don't have to go do that. The way it gets into Pleiades is thanks to lots of hard work by lots of people. Here is our masthead and our list of contributors. I think we have about 125 registered contributors to Pleiades, of whom I would guess about 15 to 20% are active in any particular month or quarter. I don't have statistics on that. I could probably get them, but with certain regulations coming into force here in Europe by the end of the month, I probably will just dump all that data and get rid of it, or at least anonymize it. These folks, how do they work? I'd like to show you that. I'm going to log into Pleiades with an account that has the same set of permissions and capabilities as any of our contributors. And then I'm going to take you to fix something that needs help. And that is the site of Hania in Crete. This is a settlement on Crete, roughly about here, that has a life in the Minoan world and goes on to be important in subsequent cultures up until today. And I think this reference could be better. We come in and we have a nice summary. That's okay. We have some names, but right off the bat, I see some gaps. As someone who's worked in Pleiades. There's Kydonia, which I think is the standard ancient Greek name for it, but I'm not actually seeing any Greek here. I wonder why that is. Maybe that's something I could fix. This orange color tells me as a standard Pleiades user that this is an item that is undergoing review right now. So this is a user, Elias Kolobos, has submitted an Ottoman Turkish name for Hania, but it hasn't actually been published yet. So if I weren't logged in, I wouldn't see this. Why am I seeing it? I can't click through it because it's not mine. I'm just a other regular contributor. But I'm seeing it so that I don't go and create the same thing that then the editors have to sort out a duplicate. I can see that someone else is already doing the Ottoman Turkish. Fortunately, I wasn't interested in doing the Ottoman Turkish because I don't know anything about it, so I'm going to move on. But the other thing I don't see here is a modern name. I don't see a modern name for Hanya, and that seems a likely thing that somebody would search for. I found it because the alternate form is showing up somewhere in the text of the page, but it's not registered as a name. So that's something we could add. How would I do that? Well, the first thing I do is I say I want to add a name. The Pleiades software creates for me a form that I can fill out. I'm going to do this, since it's a modern name, on the basis of Wikipedia, because Wikipedia knows everything, about the modern world, right? Certainly, if there is a place name as an article title in Wikipedia, even if it's wrong, it's being used by lots of people because it's in Wikipedia. I happen to know that Hanya is the name of this place in Crete. I'm going to use Wikipedia as an example of a modern place. That's the form. This is going to be the English version of the name that we're going to put into Pleiades. I have to find my... When we're dealing with English names, it's very easy because the attested form of the name is exactly the same as the Romanized form because we use the Roman alphabet. Were we dealing with Greek or something else, we would put the attested form in Unicode Greek in the attested form field, and then we would provide one or more romanization forms so that we can facilitate search on a Romanized form that corresponds to a particular attested ancient name, and also so that users who can't read Greek nonetheless perhaps have something that they can sort of pronounce to themselves that helps that name stick in their head when they're looking at the page. And of course, if you're using the data somewhere else, having those alternate romanizations can be very useful in matching up the data. This is a geographic name, not an ethnic name. I'm certain that it really is associated with the place, and it's a modern name. Over here, Hanya is attested. It's definitely not Akkadian. It's English. And I feel that the transcription is complete and reliable. References. Where did I get this information from? I got it from Wikipedia. How do I represent that information? Well, the first thing is I'm using it as evidence for the name. So I have to indicate what my reason for citing it is. And I'm going to cheat by going to the Pleiades Zotero library. How many people know Zotero? It's a bibliographic reference and citation management system. It's open. It's really great. Pleiades uses it to manage our structured bibliographic data because we didn't want to write one ourselves. There's a joke that all digital humanities problems ultimately fail on the basis of 2 or 3 things, and one of them is attempting to model bibliographic data and citation. Because it is both a common and tedious process. But we're going to get a identifier for the English Wikipedia, English language Wikipedia. We're going to paste it in to our bibliographic field, and we're going to ask Pleiades to go talk to Zotero, and it's going to bring over the short title for the work. It's constructed a formatted citation that doesn't look very pretty right now. We have some work to do there. And what we want to do is we want to add the citation, and when we're citing citing Wikipedia, we use the title of the article, and then we want the link to the particular article, which goes in here. We don't want to just send you to the top of the encyclopedia. There's my reference. So in creating this name, I've done the basic task of what's the attested form, what's its language, how certain am I about it, does it get Romanized in a particular way, what time period does it belong in, and how, on what basis am I asserting that this is really a name for the place that I didn't make up. That's enough. I can save this. And I, all by myself, when logged in, can see the results, looking just like any other name entry in Pleiades. The difference being that it's in our so-called drafting state. This means that it's not public. If you went to this in an unauthenticated browser session, you would not see anything. I have to submit it for review in order to alert the editors that I'm ready for them to consider my submission. I could put the comment here that we really should have the modern name. I think that's self-evident, so I won't bother. And now it's pending review. I can't make any changes to this unless I retract it, taking it out of the editorial queue, so on. What happens for the editors? Let's find out. I'm going to change avatars. I'm going to manifest now as a Pleiades editor, and I'm going to go look at the same page. I have some options now that the user didn't. Namely, I can publish this externally, or I can send it back. I can review this. I'm going to go ahead and publish it because this is a demonstration, plus I think this is a relatively straightforward assertion to make about this particular place. And as quickly as that, we've added that name to the Hania entry. Right here. This is the same general process that's used to add a location, to add a new place, to make modifications to existing place. Let's say you wanted to add bibliography or something else to improve the summary. Users can go in and either check out a working copy of something that's there, or they can go to the very top and add an entirely new item, which then goes through this process of drafting, pending, review, and ultimate publication. That's our so-called workflow. That's the curation process for an individual contribution to Pleiades. We can also, and this is has been a relatively laborious process over time, but we're getting to the point where we can do it more quickly. We can bring material in large groups. And this is something that's very important to us as we develop more collaborations. We have probably about 30 or 40 projects that we are somewhere in the process of talking to about bringing data into Pleiades in some way or another. There are various modes in which we can do that. I'm not going to show you the process because it involves command line and running code and waiting for the database to update and handling errors. But the modes are several. We can have another data set that someone else has produced that we're going to essentially duplicate in Pleiades. We're going to bring in all those names and all that content, and we're going to cite the source we got it from and point at their website if they have a website, or cite their book, or whatever it is. That can be done kind of in a batch process so long as the data is carved up the right way and we understand how it relates to the Pleiades data model inside. We can also do it by just by reference. So we simply add a bibliographic reference that says there's related data over here on the web, go there. And so we're not bringing in any of their content, we're just creating a connection. In practical terms, there's a range of things we might want to bring into Pleiades, even if we're not taking over someone's data. We sometimes serve as kind of the final harbor of a data set that's been created for a particular research project, and then they're not going to publish the data, they're not going to continue updating it, they'd rather see it become part of Pleiades. Or it's a project that has its own publication life, it has its own website and so on, and what we want to do is link people across it. But if it does additional place names, we'd really like to have that toponymy so that people searching on the Pleiades side can find the match anyway. Some examples of projects we're working with in this area, the Coptics Scriptorium, which is going to be around online for a long time, but they have all the Coptic toponyms for the sites there that are in their texts. There's a Syriac gazetteer that's very interesting, it's very good, and has Syriac and Arabic and Aramaic toponyms from many places that are in Pleiades already, and they went to the trouble of actually figuring out which Pleiades places they are. So that's going to be a very easy citation and import process for us, because we don't have to match them up and disambiguate which Alexandria or whatever. We also have material that was cited in codex form in much of our source data. The Palais Real Encyclopedia, this giant multi-volume thing, various reference works that are now in the process of being digitized or being replaced by digital resources that are available over the web. And so we have kind of retroactive adding the links in projects that are going on around our bibliographic data. And then there are, I can't resist showing you this one, the Rus Africum website, which is fairly recently published, which is an online presentation of a I think multi-decade archaeological survey project in Tunisia that has brought all this material on, and we're in the process of being able to link to each individual entry in their data set so that we can provide the kind of general picture context to the survey, and they can continue to provide all the archaeological detail. But they're giving us better coordinates by way of doing that. Let's talk a bit about features. We've gone through Pleiades pretty fast because I know people are interested in dinner and things like that. But I did want to point out a few things that may not have been evident in this fast presentation. One of them is the Pleiades URI. What's a Pleiades URI? A URI, let's define it first, is a uniform resource identifier. There are various formats defined by the World Wide Web Consortium and the internet, various internet authorities for what a URI is or how it can be constructed. But they include things that you're used to seeing as web addresses that begin with the HTTP or HTTPS protocol and have, some string of characters after them. So you could assert that, in fact, this link, which would give you a nice definition of a uniform resource identifier, is itself a uniform resource identifier for the Wikipedia page in question. Pleiades creates uniform resource identifiers, or in this case we call them a canonical URI, for each and every place page in Pleiades. You can think of this as the passport number for every place in Pleiades. Just as a passport number is associated with a document that identifies an individual, so the Pleiades URI identifies this document, this record of information is associated with a particular ancient place. We do this to provide for a couple kinds of important functions, one of which is citation. We cite things in codexes in traditional long-form academic papers for a variety of reasons. We glossed over some of the kinds of reasons we might cite something when we were doing that name. We cite things for reference. We cite them to point to another argument. We cite them to indicate provenance of evidence or argument that we're presenting instead of just plagiarizing it. And we do all of that to support the scholarly and educational machinery of understanding a particular topic, of learning more about it, of checking the validity of received assertion. And on the web, we have this wonderful mechanism in the form of hyperlinks that lets us make that immediately actionable. Instead of the trip to the library that has the book and so on, where we have a link on the web, we can transit it immediately and examine what's cited. The functions are analogous, particularly they're identical in the context of Pleiades. We want people to be able to cite a Pleiades entry and be able to get back to it. Websites that don't do this, frankly, break the web and don't serve our understanding of modern scholarship and modern communication in a useful way. If I'm casting aspersions on somebody's really fancy JavaScript website that only gives me access to things through a query result, I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel. You really should identify the individual discrete bits of information that you want people to be able to cite. Otherwise, you're not participating in the scholarly process, and you're throwing hundreds of years of methodological development out the door. Citation. We also want our data to be as useful as possible. Right? Our data is open. You can go to the downloads link and you can download it in several different formats. You can scrape it off our website. You can write a web application that interacts with our Json API, which I'll talk about in a second, and get a subset of our data to do things with. We think this is a model that other scholarly data sets and websites and web applications should follow as well. And there are many that under various kinds of licenses and various kinds of regimes and in various formats are making their data available for other people to use. Databases of coins, databases of mythological figures found in ancient art, databases of archaeological information, so on and so forth. Many of you will have examples of these kinds of things that you want to think about. Pleiades provides to that community, to the extent that they find it useful, a way to provide their users with interoperable geography. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, if you were to download the Epigraphic Databank of Heidelberg and the Epigraphic Database Roma, which is headquartered at the Sapienza in Rome, and you were to try to bring together those data sets, you would not find it easy to group all of the inscriptions from a particular place out of the two data sets because they each recorded the geography differently with a slightly different string of characters to mean a particular place. It was just a text field that had the geography in it. And you'd be fine for some of the biggies. You'd be fine for some of the matches. But when you got into duplicates, you might find that you had to manually sort out circumlocutions. Oh, it's this Alexandria in Turkey as opposed to this Alexandria in Afghanistan, all this sort of stuff. Those projects have now taken on the process of not just having whatever name they want to display for the place, but having the corresponding Pleiades ID. They know their data. They've gone in, they've figured out what the relationships are. And now you download or receive both of those data sets, and it's as simple as matching that field in your database software. You have the geography united. And this is true of the data sets of the American Numismatic Society, a number of other digital projects. And this is not so much to praise Pleiades for having done this, but to indicate one of the major desires of our colleagues that we responded to, which was give us a way to make it easier to bring the data together. And now we can do this either when you download the data sets for a particular research project, or you can do it online using mechanisms associated with linked open data and the semantic web. You can build a web application that dynamically brings together information from different data sets. There's a little example going on here that's broken. I almost tried to fix it this morning. I'm sure I know what's wrong, but given that I had to demonstrate it this afternoon, I thought I'd better not break the entire site right before my talk. So I didn't fix it. You should be able to click through here and get all the coins and go to also the Pleiades 3 website, but you can't. On every single place page, we pop this up. If people are interested during the question time, I could demonstrate to you a little bit. This partner project, Pelagios, unfortunately also begins with a P and is a Greek word, that has been working with all the parties that want to connect cultural heritage resources and ancient textual resources around geography. And I can show you some of the applications they've developed to exploit these relationships. But I think we'd be better off, given the time and the fact that the Pleiades bit of it's not working at the moment, to defer that if people are interested. The one other thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll try to transition into comments and questions, is the business that I alluded to at the beginning, which was the HTML page, the thing that appears in your browser is not the Pleiades record for a given place. It is not the Pleiades information resource. It is, in computer parlance, a serialization of a particular set of data in our database. It takes information that is in our database and turns it into a particular format that is suitable for display in a web browser. On some level, every computing system deals with levels of abstraction in this way. There's an underlying computational format that corresponds to some set of standard relationships to numbers, so we get all the way down to gates on little silicon chips. But in Pleiades, we're very serious about not privileging the HTML. We don't write a web page about each of these places. You've seen the forms we fill out. That's not creating a web page. That's creating data in our database, which then, when I go in and my browser says I want the HTML page for this, the website constructs it from the context of the content of the database. Consequently, we can have other representations as well. Firefox is being a little picky about selecting here. We have several that we surface here. The most comprehensive is JSON, which I'm going to show you. This JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a language for shoving data around the web. It's favored right now by people who write web applications in particular because it's compact, it's well structured, and you can directly mess with it in JavaScript and some other languages that are popular right now. And it contains all the bits and pieces of the stuff you were looking at in HTML, but in a format that's readily useful for writing some web application that does something with this data. Also generated on demand from our database. There are several other representations that we support. Atom was is a format that was created to provide a way to, like RSS, to monitor for changes in a particular web resource. They were used on blogs for a while. It's not as widely used now, which I think is a shame because it's a really great format. KML, Keyhole Markup Language, this is what Google Earth speaks. So if I were to click on this, we'd see something in Google Earth. And then a couple of the formats that are widely used in linked open data, the so-called Resource Description Framework, or RDF, which has various, I'm not sure what the best term of art is, syntax representations, either in the extensible markup language or in a fun thing called Turtle, which maybe I can open for you because my browser doesn't like it. Yeah, I really don't want to open it in Protégé because we'll be here all night. It's actually a nifty little text format that does the same kind of thing that the JSON's doing, but using a different sort of modeling approach. Basically, though it's not, until you get your head around how it's laid out, it's not obvious here, but basically this is a bunch of three-word sentences about the Pleiades place resource. You have a subject, a verb, and a predicate. So I can say this thing is a place. It has a name. The name has this attested form. The name has this romanized form. The name is in this language. All these kinds of little, you're talking to a very literal, articulate, but completely stupid 5-year-old, basically. And that's how the terse RDF triple language works. And this, again, is a mechanism that other people can use to write applications around to work with Pleiades data. So the business of Un-GIS, if I can conclude by coming back to that word. This is a term of art that was invented by Sean Gillis, who was a developer who worked with us early on Pleiades and has much to do with the intellectual construct of our information. Invented when he got tired of people emailing him and asking him, where are the shapefiles? If you work with Esri geographic information systems, you know that the shapefile is one of the native formats that they foisted upon the world. And it's very useful for lots of kinds of things, but for all the reasons I've enumerated, we don't do things that way. We could produce a shapefile serialization, but nobody who ever actually wanted to use it for something has come to us and asked for one. Lots of geographic information systems people have said, why don't you do shapefiles? Well, would you use it if I did? Well, no, but people surely would. We've never actually had a case where somebody couldn't do what they wanted to do with our data without a shapefile, so we haven't done it. But in any case, Sean coined this term to give us a way to talk about, an entry to talking about these differences that I've laid out for you today, the business of unlocateds, the business of being concerned about connections as kind of first-class things in the data set instead of just some attribute off in a table somewhere. The business of being able to have things without labels, things without names, things without coordinates. That's an Un-GIS for us. And it's a nice way to get an opportunity to come to Paris in the spring and give a talk. And I thank you very much for your patience and your interest, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Do you have concrete reuse examples?
Concrete reuse examples in terms that we have, I think there are about 30 projects that I know of that have incorporated our identifiers into their data sets and systems, probably more. We have several examples of pedagogical uses of Pleiades in classroom contexts at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. I know just from download statistics that there's a some number of downloads of our entire data set on a monthly basis, probably 15 or 20 times. And those at least represent some kind of exploration with an idea towards use. They're not, these are apart from bot hits, which we don't let download our stuff because they can get the individual bits, but we don't want them downloading the big zip files every time because that's a waste. So I could find a couple to give you as examples, but in principle, any project that has data in Pleiades will have either incorporated our identifiers or one of the other gazetteers they support, which are gazetteers that have incorporated our identifiers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be all grouped together in that system. So, does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much. So 2 small questions. The first, could you explain better the relationship with Pelagios and with Antiquity à la carte? And the second question, do you intend at some point to include geoarchaeological research? So, you know, most of the ancient Greek and Roman sites are on the coast, and the landscape is totally different. So the coast is not there anymore, the water is higher. So do you intend to include this kind of research, and how do you imagine one could include this? Thank you.
Right, so two very different and equally interesting questions, which I'll try to answer. Pelagios is a project that was started by researchers at multiple institutions, a couple of them in the UK and also one in Austria, with the idea in the first instance of making, demonstrating that you could actually do this business of taking Pleiades identifiers, putting them into other data sets, and bringing them together on the web in a dynamic way. The current manifestation of this is a website called Peripleo, yet another word beginning in P from Greek heritage. The periplus is a particular kind of coastal itinerary. It means sailing around. And is an ancient genre of geographic writing, and one that persists as well. So Peripleo gives us a mechanism. Let's see. Let's look at Lyon. How about? Not quite sure why we get different answers, but I'm going to click on that one. And sure enough, it's the Pleiades Lyon, which these other gazetteers also provide identifying numbers for. And they're picking up here the Pleiades summary. So they're reusing our data dynamically to tell you what you're looking at. But they've combined the names from multiple gazetteers because these other gazetteers also know about Pleiades, and so they combine the names. The Parapleo interface asserts that there are 18,276 items in other data collections that Parapleo has been given that relate to Pleiades, and so or relate to Lyon, and that must mean that those data sets contain either the Pleiades ID or one of these other gazetteer IDs. And we can get that list and scroll through all 18,000 of them. Here we have, but we can get an idea of what some of the collections are. The American Numismatic Society. So if we wanted to look at some coins of Lyon, looks like some other coinage stuff coming out of the Numisma project. So coins will make your numbers increase a lot, and that may be that it's all coins. No, we could spend all day scrolling down through this. But let's look at one just for giggles. How about this one? So this is a this is in the British Museum collection. We can go from Pelagios to their page. Unfortunately, they don't have a picture, which is what everybody wants, really, is a picture of the coin. But so Parapleo, in the first instance, is meant to demonstrate that this kind of linking works, that you can bring together multiple gazetteers that know about each other, and then other data sets that know about one or more of those gazetteers, and then provide services around that aggregation of data. You could imagine faceting the search results in some way. I want to see coins. I want to see, starting to dig into the metadata that's not geography in order to give you a discovery or a classification experience that's more interesting. But Pelagios is also now doing things other than Parapleo. They also have a tool called Recogito, which is designed to let you work with historical maps and geographic text resources and go through the process of matching them up with a particular gazetteer. And they run a program of mini grants funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to facilitate the creation of additional geographic data for one or another of these projects. So we have some medieval Spanish toponymy in Pleiades that came in through a mini grant project that Pelagios funded. There are some others in the offing. There's also a project that's working on a monuments gazetteer for Rome. That's what Pelagios is doing. In some ways, really just trying to push this sort of work forward in various ways, either with demonstration software and services, or by facilitating collaborative work. Does that answer the Pelagios portion
Absolutely.
of the question? Okay. Can you restate for me again the other question, because I'm only holding on to kind of a generic idea.
Yeah, in the first question, it was also the relationship with the Ancient World Mapping Center, so
Okay.
with the Antiquité à la carte.
Yeah, so the Ancient World Mapping Center is actually the birthplace of Pleiades. I'll open up, do a little bit of background here. Prior to Pleiades, there was a project called the Classical Atlas Project. This was a project first imagined by the American Philological Association, which is now called the Society for Classical Studies. It's the major professional organization of classical scholars in North America. And they had identified cartography as being a major area for a lack of good reference resources in the late 1970s. So put yourself in the 1970s and what you know about the history of geographic computing. You have GIS by this time, but it's not sitting on your desktop. It's running on a big thing that heats up an entire room somewhere in a government or military context in most cases. So it was conceived as a print atlas. It's a big double folio thing. You've got a picture of one of the map spreads there. The project really didn't get rolling until the 1990s. And it was published in the year 2000 by Princeton University Press. That data that was assembled for the Barrington Atlas was the initial creation content for Pleiades. It was produced partly digitally, but none of it in none of the kind of compilation data was done in GIS. There was some GIS work done by the professional cartographers to produce about half the maps because the whole GIS thing happened while the atlas was developing. But the Pleiades came out of the realization that a 10-year effort, costing millions of dollars, requiring hundreds of scholars, really is not something we want to do again in a big rush in 100 years, because that's effectively what was happening with the Classical Atlas project. A long period of neglect, plenty of individual regional research, all that sort of thing, but the actual bringing together a reference resource, attempts were made, but they had failed, and so you have that. This was also the concern that led to the creation of the Ancient World Mapping Center at the University of North Carolina, was that this expertise, this way of doing things, this concern was not the focus of any other research center in the world. Yes, there are a lot of cartographic and historical cartographic and archaeological cartographic enterprises, but none that took the whole Greek and Roman world or the whole ancient world as their concern. They were more regional or national or thematic in construct. And so the Ancient World Mapping Center was born with this kind of general mission to make sure that this didn't get neglected. And so Pleiades was originally dreamed up as a way of how are we going to get everybody else to do the work that we were paying people to do with the grants, because we don't have the grants anymore. This was around the birth of Wikipedia. So the idea of crowdsourcing was something that seemed like you might want to try. I mean, I think in the context of, in retrospect, and in the context of scholarly projects, we might better call it nerd sourcing or geek sourcing or something like that, because you know the crowd at large is not necessarily going to want to contribute to something like that. But at any rate, and so the Ancient World Mapping Center was the first entity to get a grant to do the Pleiades work, and it was when I moved to NYU in 2008 that the kind of coordinating center shifted to the Institute for the Study of Ancient World with me at NYU. But the Ancient World Mapping Center remained a partner. Our second managing editor has always been the director of the Ancient World Mapping Center, which is a position that tends to rotate every few years. And the Ancient World Mapping Center has continued to do work that both makes use of and contributes to Pleiades content. So they have a big project that produced an online interactive map application for Strabos geography and accompanied a recent publication that they were supporting with custom mapping work. And it used data from Pleiades, and wherever they felt that the Pleiades data wasn't good enough, they made the improvements in Pleiades and then made use of it. So there's an ongoing collaborative relationship there. There's a piece of software that was written by Ryan Horn when he was at the Ancient World Mapping Center called Antiquity a la carte. This is designed to do some of the things for you that Pleiades doesn't do, like give you a map of lots of Pleiades places all at one time. You notice I didn't show you a comprehensive map of Pleiades content. That's because Pleiades doesn't do that. But Antiquity a la carte does, and it will also let you customize that map. You can take things off and put them on, download it as a PDF. It has a mechanism that some instructors really like, which is to create map tests where you can substitute the labels with numbers. So you can inflict that on your students to make sure they understand a particular bit of geography. And so the that relationship is still there. Antiquity a la carte makes use of a copy of the Pleiades data that's updated on, I don't know if it's nightly, but very frequently, and they link back and forth, so you can move back and forth between them. Is that?
Absolutely. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yeah.
Another question? I have a quick one. Do you have any regret with your data model?
Every day. I think that anybody who does data modeling, no, I don't actually. I have opportunities because we fortunately don't have a data model that is static. I mean, we can make changes to it, and I'll evoke the late Elaine Matthews, who for many years ran the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names project at Oxford, which is an onomastic project that began life on handwritten file cards, and then went to IBM punch cards, and then went through several different databases and into an XML application, and so on. And she gave a talk whenever the Epigraphic Congress was in Oxford, which is probably going on 10 years ago now, on that experience and the dread we all have of what happens when the technology gets old. What do we do when we have to change? And apart from the issues of resources, which are always there, she said you should view these as opportunities, because they are. They're an opportunity to find out how your data could be better. They're an opportunity to intervene in that. The need to refine a data model or move to a new kind of data structure or technology creates opportunities to improve your content. And so, yeah, connections. We didn't have connections at all to begin with, but we've evolved connections. We have a lot of connections in Pleiades now that go back to a moment when we didn't have types for connections. It's just this raw, I mean, you think of one, place resource pointing at another one saying, unconnected. That's all it was. And the idea was to see, well, is this useful at all? Do we build out this great thing? And what happened was immediately the editors and contributors said, oh, we could use this for rivers. We could use this for aqueducts. We can use this for this, that, and the other thing. And, and so did I at one point regret that connections were not typed, that I hadn't fought with Sean and made him type them? No. I mean, realistically, this happens incrementally. And what we've done now, adding the types, was at the right time. And yes, we have some legacy data that we have to go back and revisit because they don't have the typing on them. But we also know we've done it right. We didn't rush into something that we then had to disassemble. So I think it's interesting work to do, and so it doesn't make me regret it.
For the clarification on the relationship between Pleiades and Recogito and
okay.
and so on, because I think for a lot of people, it really seems like the same thing that has evolved
I see.
multiple forms. I think at some point it was really clear, at least to me and some people, that Pleiades wasn't Pleiades 2.0. Which leads me to this question, actually. What's the future of Pleiades? I mean, there is a restriction on the number of threads for the humanities in the US. But in this context, what are you looking forward?
Well, so there's both short-term and long-term answers to that question. Long-term, I can't predict nor foresee how long Pleiades.stoa.org as a website that does these particular things or things like them is going to continue to be of value to the community. I think it's going to be of value for some years to decades. That's my guess. Beyond that, in terms of long-term thinking, what we're trying to do is make our data open, make our data, render our data in standard formats, embed as much of the description of the data and how it's organized in the data itself, and then distribute copies of that information in as many archival contexts, both formal and informal, as we can find to make use of. This is a slow process, but it's one we're doing. We regularly deposit into NYU's own Faculty Digital Archive, which is a long-term preservation system that the university has developed, and that does certain kinds of things to make sure that data doesn't change, that it's copied in multiple geographic locations, and so on. We also publish via a system called zenodo.org. So we're trying to plan for graceful obsolescence, I think is the term. I think I stole that from Bethany Novisky, who runs the Digital Library Federation in the US. But the idea is to not always imagine we'll always be limping Pleiades along to the next step, but to try to lay in mechanisms for other people to take the data and do things with it, either now or later, whether we're here or not. So there's that kind of long-term concern. In terms of the short term, one of the reasons that the home location for Pleiades moved from the Ancient World Mapping Center to NYU was the perception that the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World would be in a better position to support the basic care and feeding of Pleiades over the long haul for various institutional reasons. And that so far proves to be true. Our basic costs, which consist of leasing our server and all those kinds of basic staying on the web bits and pieces, are part of the annual IT budget at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. That's a decision that our past director made, and it's become a standard process because we use the data and the services in so many other digital initiatives we have at the Institute and with our partners. That it's seen as a core asset, like our library collection. And and I do a portion of my time on Pleiades as a matter of course. But beyond that, it's dependent on volunteer labor for content creation. Our editors are volunteers. They get nothing but kudos and maybe things they can put on their CV for that. And so that's, on one level, it's very precarious. There are some ways in which their work could be facilitated by identifying postdoc positions, graduate positions that could be funded and finding funding for them. And we also have the concern of the non-annual sorts of technical costs that come when your software framework hits some kind of a wall and you need to make a transition. We're using open source software. It's a great community that supports the Plone content management system, which is what we've customized for Pleiades. But something could happen to that community. It could decide to stop doing what it's doing, or it could take the software in a direction that doesn't work for us, and eventually the old version we're running on acquires a security problem or a performance problem or something else that would need extra money and expertise to fix or replace. And those are unknowns in our planning that we hope will be successful in finding partners who care about it. We'd like to move who can help us financially or can help us technologically. We hope to move our relationships with collaborating projects and institutions to the point where we have memoranda of understanding between us that institutionally reinforce the importance of the shared resource and commit institutions at least to providing graceful discontinuation of services, right? Imagine a day, I'll pick it far too far in the future, 57 years from now, when New York University decides they no longer want to support Pleiades. Maybe by then we have signed relationships between New York University and the École and several other institutions that obligate New York University to keep it running for a full year after giving notification to the partners, so that the partners have time to figure out what to do. Could we move it somewhere else? Could we replace it? These kinds of social engagements are things we're thinking about doing to try, and institutional steps to try to mitigate some of that risk. People are using it. I take great satisfaction and comfort in that people use Pleiades a lot, so they'll be mad if it goes away. So if there's a crisis, I won't be the only one going down with the ship or whatever. So.
Geoarchaeology, if you intend to do something with that.
With archaeological data?
Geoarchaeology, reconstruction of seashore.
Oh gosh, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot that. Yeah, so we have, let me see if I can get you an example. By way of not giving you a satisfactory answer, if you'll take, if it will load the map, which, here we go. This is ancient Cadiz in Spain. This is the modern terrain. I invite you to find that gulf today. It's not there, it's silted in. The Guadalquivir has filled an ancient bay that we do depict on our base map. Where does this base map come from? This base map was developed by the Ancient World Mapping Center. Ryan Horn had a lot to do with it, again. And it was built on the basis of the landscape reconstruction work that was done initially for the Barrington Atlas. The bases in the Barrington Atlas try to provide reconstructed coastlines, reconstructed river courses, get rid of modern dams and their associated reservoirs, that sort of thing, but correlated with shuttle radar topographic mapper data. So it's been warped and more detail added. But it is a particular point in time. The Ancient World Mapping Center, this is like smack dab in the middle of the early Roman period, I think, based on their estimation. And what it doesn't incorporate, moreover, is modeling results. By and large, what the Barrington Atlas compilers did, at least this is my understanding of it, was to look at geophysical and archaeological publications that they could find and where those venture to reconstruction to follow them. With rivers, they sometimes procured, the earliest available triangulated mapping, so that for the Nile, the Danube, things like this, and said, well, early modern is as good as we can get in the absence of geophysical survey and other things. So we'll go with that. It's at least before 20th century industrial control of rivers. But in terms of the data model extending to things like a stretch of coastline, we'd have to think long and hard about how to do that. And I think we're in a space where the geometry and how you articulate it and how you work with it is more challenging than what we've done so far. I mean, yes, we have lots of physical features in, but they're things that are easier to drop a point in the middle of, or easier to sort of evoke as a place, a bay, a mountain or a mountain range, that sort of thing. But we do have the facility to have multiple locations associated with places. So, you could have alternate river courses at different periods. You could give the bay alternate coastlines at different periods. So I think the answer to your question is three-part. One, you're not the first person to ask this question, and we have a couple of people who are longtime Pleiades collaborators who are interested in this. Have we done anything? No, not really. But we've thought about it a little bit and said, oh, that's hard and interesting. And will we do something about it? Maybe. That would be cool. So that's where we're at.